Thank you.
Just a housekeeping note. Questions are best kept to the very end, I think, after all four speakers have been allowed to have their say. Thank you.
The consensus was we would do it here. Yeah, this is a huge honor for me to be here. I have had a close relationship with this collection and through my wife, Niamh, and I was actually at not only the opening at this exhibition, but I was actually at the opening of the museum in Quinnipiac. So to be here at the last day of the exhibition in Skibbereen is quite emotional, actually, in ways. As has been said, I wrote a piece on the famine in West Cork for the Foley series. And the reason was, I suppose, when I was at university, I studied history, and the famine was part of it. So when Niamh started working on this, the collection and the museum in the States, I started looking at the famine again. And I'd been writing about the press, and so I decided I'd try and look at the press and the famine. Now, I didn't want to sort of just say, what was covered, how did they cover the famine? I wanted to look and say, how did the press develop? How did they handle it? What was it like to be a journalist in the 1840s? So what I'm going to talk to you tonight is just a few thoughts on, I suppose, how did journalists represent the unrepresentable? The famine posed huge problems for the press in Ireland. The journalist's skill set was a rather limited one, limited to reporting often at length the speeches and comments of men in authority, MPs, local authority members, judges, coroners. We've got to remember at this stage, journalists actually didn't know how to do it. It's odd for us to realize it. But Dickens, for instance, who was a journalist, wrote Oliver Twist in only 1838, and he had to fictionalize his account of the poor of London, which today would be done by an investigative journalist or something. So it wasn't unusual that Irish journalists wouldn't know how to do this. It just wasn't part of what journalists knew how to do or what they would do. So the 1840s, notwithstanding the famine, was a period of change in Ireland and much of Europe. The cultural historian Uillinn calls it a saddle period. Well, actually, he uses quite a long German word, but it's a saddle period. And when people looked both backwards and forwards. And philosophically, the idea of a common humanity was becoming an increasingly popular concept since the Enlightenment, culminating in the French Revolution, the formulation of the rights of man, and philosophers such as Immanuel Kant, who maintained that human beings were owed respect because of their humanity and they were capable of reason. The other side of that mountain, col or saddle, was the providentialism of much of the British establishment, the view that famine was God's will, a divine response to sloth, laziness, and Catholicism. And this was coupled with Malthusian political economy and the view that famine was inevitable and had the added benefit of teaching virtuous behavior. Within the sort of new capitalist economies, the peasant were becoming workers, but they were still considered a collective. But they were also becoming individual consumers, and the more progressive publications were constantly trying to find new ways of reflecting the individual in their stories. Benedict Anderson says it was print capitalism which made it possible for rapidly growing numbers of people to think about themselves and relate themselves to others in profoundly new ways. James Vernon, in a wonderful history of hunger, says the hungry became figures of humanitarian concern only when novel forms of news reporting connecting people emotionally with the suffering of the hungry and refuted the Malthusian model of causation. In this sense, hunger first becomes news in the 1840s. So what were these new ways of reporting? Well, if the reporters themselves weren't sure how you would actually tell the story of poverty, the newspaper editors looked to other people to do it for them. And here in West Cork, there was Dr. Robert Trail, who was director and vicar of Schull, who wrote in the Cork Constitution very profoundly emotional pieces. He died of famine fever himself. Dr. Daniel Donovan wrote in the Southern Reporter, and he was a medical officer of the Skibbereen Dispensary and Union Workhouse, and actually probably the most well-known writer coming out of the famine, at least journalistically. He wrote Diary of a Dispensary Doctor, which I always think the alliteration is sort of nicely tabloid in a way. And the Cork Examiner had its regular contributors from West Cork, Jeremiah O'Callaghan. So these people, in effect, took over the role which today would be covered by journalists, and they did it because the journalists didn't really know if that was their job. What the journalists did do, and the papers are all full of them, is cover inquests. And the inquests showed that when people who died and how they died and the appalling conditions in which they died in showed that the poor were actually innocent. But there is one story which I want to talk about. Is it up there? A slide of the Bridget O'Donnell, which I thought was going to be up there, but it's not. Do I have a clicker? Is this it? Oh, there it is. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's just the one. I've only got the one thing. Anyway, this is Bridget O'Donnell and her children. It appears in the Illustrated London News, and it's amazingly important for a number of reasons. In many ways, she symbolizes the way the famine changes journalism. It is an image of a famine victim from County Clare, as I say, Bridget O'Donnell and her children, which appears in 1849 in the Illustrated London News. It's well known to anyone with the slightest interest in Great Famine or Irish history. It is, to use that rather cliché word, iconic. She is familiar to us from book covers and pamphlets, and she is the starting point of many contemporary images commemorating the famine. Artists such as Rowan Gillespie and John Behan have incorporated her image into their sculptural pieces, which are in the exhibition, which you, of course, can't see anymore because it's closed. She holds a place in press history for two reasons. First, we know who she is, and that is incredibly unusual. Newspapers and periodicals did not deal in human interest. They did not tell us about the poor except in the most general terms. And the only way people like Bridget O'Donnell would have been named in a paper of the day was if she appeared in court or was before some sort of public hearing or tribunal. The poor were mentioned anonymously, of course, or part of a mob or peasantry, but they were seldom identified by name. The second reason is that the words that actually appear on the other page, which is a first-person interview, where she said about she and her husband had 4 acres of land, half of it was bog, about how she had given birth to a baby who died at birth, about her 13-year-old son had died, and about the fact that she was probably going to die herself. And it is a story narrated by a destitute woman, cheated of her home and possessions, and devastated by the death of her 13-year-old son. And she's shorn the knowledge of her own not-too-distant death as well. The article attempts to engage the reader emotionally and convey the scale and depth and gravity of the situation directly from the mouth of the victim to the reader of the paper, and this by means of an interview. Now, for those of us who've got this sort of a rather nerdy interest in press history, this is amazing, because the first interview is meant to be in 1859, when Horace Greeley interviewed Brigham Young for the New York Tribune. On this side of the Atlantic, interviews don't appear until the 1880s and 90s, and then the Times had a wonderful policy that you could never interview anyone in England. You could only interview foreigners, because the interview was seen as rather low form of journalism. And there was, I think it's Dickens, actually, I can't remember what novel, he laughs in his book at the American journalists who go off and interview people. It's considered slightly unethical. But here, in 1849, is an interview with a woman appears in the Illustrated London News, an incredibly respectable middle-class publication. When it started, the publishers sent free copies to every vicar in Britain on the basis it was seen on the coffee tables, if they had coffee tables then, of vicars, then everyone would know it was a respectable journal. So it was a conservative publication, and here was an interview. So the interesting is why this occurs. Of course, the interview isn't an interview in the sense that the later ones become. The only reason it's there, in a way, is because the artist who drew the picture, wanted to show it was true. Because, of course, the reason James Mahoney was in Ireland doing these illustrations because no one could actually believe that the newspapers that they read in London from Ireland, they could actually be true. Could this really be happening in the world's largest, most progressive empire, as they say? And, of course, Ireland, because of the Act of Union, was an integral part of the United Kingdom. So in the first half of the 19th century, there is tension within the British governing elite between protectionism and free trade, and between traditional landlord class and the interests of new capitalist class. The famine occurs during the height of this debate, and journalists, amongst others, seek ways to include the hungry in its coverage. As Vernon notes, in the wake of the new Poor Law, the Irish famine, journalists and social innovators developed new techniques to represent the innocent suffering of the hungry by giving it a human face, and they ensured that hunger, both home and abroad, becomes a focal point of humanitarian concern. So that's why Bridget O'Donnell appeared, and that's why her interview there. Terry Eagleton, talking of the famine, says, because of the famine, Irish society undergoes a surreal speed-up of its entry upon modernity. But what spurs that process on, contradictorily, is a thoroughly traditional calamity. Part of the horror of the famine is its atavistic nature, the mind-shaking fact that an event with all the pre-modern character of a medieval pestilence happened in Ireland with frightening recentness. And when we look at the coverage of the famine, and we look especially the ones I looked at with the 3 newspapers here in Cork, you begin to understand where what we might call the grammar of disaster coverage comes from. The notion of pack journalism, the idea of everyone coming to Cork as they did was because 3 newspapers were telling them what was happening. So editors in London knew they were going to get a story. The other thing that happens is the portrayal of women and children. Susan Molo, an American writing about contemporary famine, although she could have been writing about the Irish famine, says, starving children are the famine icon. An emaciated child is not yet associated with the stereotypes attached to his colour, its culture, or its political environment. Skeletal children personify innocence abused. That brings moral clarity to the complex story of a famine. Their images cut through the social, economic, and political context to create an imperative statement, a hierarchy of innocence. And this is the first time that's done. This is the first time that children and mother are used to tell the complex story of a famine in a newspaper and in the media. And it's because they can't find how else do you tell that complex story? Well, you use innocence. And you don't then have to actually deal with the political fallout. You just show that innocence. And that's why it occurred. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mick.